Sufficient assumption questions make a lot of students feel like they're just not cut out for the LSAT. You read the question, you see terms like logically follows, properly inferred, and if assumed. Your heart rate goes up. The choices all sound fancy and logical, but none of them feel right. It's like trying to solve a math problem with all the numbers written in another language. And here's the worst part. Even when you do get one right, you're not totally sure why. You just crossed your fingers and went with what felt logical. This is what I call the guessing zone. It's the mental space students get trapped in when they haven't learned the deeper structure behind these questions. They're relying on gut feeling or vague test-taking strategies, and the LSAT eats that alive. But what if I told you that this question type is actually one of the most formulaic and beatable on the entire test? That really can happen for you when you understand what sufficient assumption questions are truly asking. Because unlike a lot of other question types, sufficient assumptions have a specific goal. Your job is to find the missing piece that guarantees the conclusion must be true if all the parts are taken as true. Not makes it more likely, not strengthens it a little, guarantees it 100% with zero wiggle room. This is not a test of your creativity. It's a test of your ability to complete the argument. You are being handed an argument that is almost complete, but there is a gap in the reasoning. And the test makers are asking you, what one sentence would you need to add to make this argument airtight? When you understand that, everything shifts. It's about learning to read arguments like an architect reads blueprints. You look at what's there, you notice what's missing, and you fill it in so the structure doesn't collapse. And if you're thinking, okay, that makes sense in theory, but real LSAT questions are way more complicated than that, you're right, they are. But the complexity is just window dressing. The logic underneath is the same every time. And once you learn how to strip away the noise and focus on the bones of the argument, what's claimed, what's given, and what's missing, these questions become not just manageable, but predictable. So if you've ever felt like sufficient assumption questions were some kind of elite logic test you were not smart enough to pass, I want to tell you right now, it's not you, it's the way it's been explained to you. And by the time we're done, you're never going to look at them the same way again. Now, most students get off track before they've even started. They see the word assumption and immediately lump this question type in with strengthen or necessary assumption. But that is a huge mistake because sufficient assumption questions play by completely different rules. A strengthen question is like patching a leak in a boat. You're not rebuilding the entire thing, you're just adding some support. You're making the conclusion a little more believable. You're nudging it in the right direction. But a sufficient assumption question is not about helping the argument. It's about completing the argument, as in, you are expected to provide the exact missing link that would make the logic work perfectly. No gaps, no question marks, no, well, maybes. Think of it like this. The LSAT gives you a broken equation. You're not choosing the number that makes the result a bit more likely. You're choosing the one exact variable that makes both sides of the equation equal. And that's where the name sufficient assumption comes from. The correct answer will be sufficient, meaning if it's true, then the argument is guaranteed to be valid. That is the key mindset shift. Let's say it again. Sufficient assumption means if this answer is true, then the conclusion must follow. No guessing, no weighing evidence, no probability. And this is what makes sufficient assumption questions easier once you understand the game. The LSAT isn't asking you to evaluate 5 choices and decide which one is best. It's asking you to test each one with a very simple standard. If this were true, would it guarantee the conclusion? If the answer is yes, you've got it. If not, eliminate it immediately. No emotion, no hesitation, just logic. Now here's where students make another big mistake. They see the word assumption and think it must be something unstated or hidden, something you've got to sense between the lines. That is true for necessary assumption questions, but not here. With sufficient assumption, the correct answer can be super blunt. It can spell out exactly what's missing. It can even repeat parts of the argument. That is not a bug, it's a feature. So please stop overcomplicating it. When you approach these questions with the right lens, one that's looking for total logical completion, you'll start to notice something strange. The right answer almost feels too obvious. That's because it's not trying to trick you. It's just trying to see if you understand what's missing and whether you can plug that hole completely. That's it. Now we're going to walk through how to do exactly that step by step, because you can't solve the puzzle if you don't know what kind of puzzle you're looking at. Before you even touch the argument, before you even try to break down a single sentence, you've got to confirm one thing. Are you dealing with a sufficient assumption question or something else that just looks similar? Because here's the problem. The LSAT uses confusing overlapping language between different question types, and that is by design. They want to test whether you can tell the difference between kind of supports and guarantees the conclusion. So let's eliminate all confusion here. Sufficient assumption questions have very specific phrasing in the question stem. If you know what to look for, you can instantly tag the question and switch your brain into the right mode. Here are some of the most common keywords for sufficient assumption: allows, enables, follows logically if assumed, and properly inferred if assumed. Anytime you see one of those keywords or phrases, it's a dead giveaway. These are not soft words. They are demanding a complete guarantee. It's like the test is saying, out of the 5 options below, only one makes this argument bulletproof. Which one is it? That's when you know you're in sufficient assumption territory. Now, let's go deeper for a second. Compare that to a strengthening question, which says, which one, if true, most strengthens the argument, or which one, if true, provides the most support for the argument. Do you notice the difference? Strengthening questions are more open-ended. They are about increasing confidence, not locking the argument in. Sufficient assumption is binary. The answer either completes the logic perfectly or it doesn't, with no middle ground. Now, once you know you're in sufficient assumption territory, everything else that follows becomes easier, because you're going to know that strong definitive language in a choice is not a red flag, it's often required. You will stop second-guessing answers just because they seem too direct, and you'll waste less time flipping back and forth trying to feel out which answer is better. Instead, you'll approach the problem with clarity and precision. You're going to want to find the one sentence that, if true, forces the conclusion to be true. Nothing else matters. So from now on, here is your quick mental checklist anytime you hit a logical reasoning question. Step 1, read the question stem first, not the stimulus. Then step 2, ask, is this requiring a guaranteed conclusion? If yes, you are activating your sufficient assumption mode. Now let's move on to how to break down the actual argument. Once you've confirmed the question type is sufficient assumption, it's time to roll up your sleeves and do the real work, breaking down the argument. And this part is where most points are won or lost. Because if you don't know what the argument is saying, you'll never figure out what it's missing. So let's start with a simple rule. Every sufficient assumption question gives you a flawed argument. The logic is always incomplete. You're being tested on whether you can spot the hole and fill it in with one perfect assumption that fixes everything. So how do you find that hole? By splitting the stimulus, aka the argument, into 3 parts. The first part is the premise, aka the evidence. This is the information the argument gives you up front as a given. Think of it like your raw ingredients. These are the facts, or the supposed facts, the author is using to try to prove something. Your job is to ID each piece of evidence and keep it separate from any conclusions or opinions. You want to strip away the fluff and focus only on what is actually being stated as true. The next part you want to look for is the conclusion, the claim the author is trying to prove. And to find it, you can use signal words like therefore, thus, it follows that, hence, or clearly. Those usually point you straight to the conclusion. Now, the author is using the premise as support, and the conclusion is the thing being supported. This distinction matters because you're not trying to fix the premise, you're trying to bridge the gap between what the author gives you, the premise, and what they want you to accept, the conclusion. Now, the final thing you're looking for is what isn't actually there, the logical gap. And this is the part that most students skip or rush through, and that's a huge mistake. Every argument on the LSAT is missing something, some connection, some link. some key assumption the author needs you to believe in order for their logic to work. This is the gap, and your job is to figure out what is the exact sentence that, if added, would connect the premise to the conclusion with 100% certainty. So let's take a simple example. Premise: every student in the math club enjoys solving puzzles. Conclusion: Lucas enjoys solving puzzles. Looks okay, right? But pause. Do we know that Lucas is in the math club? Nope, that is assumed, but not explicitly stated. The argument would work if we knew that Lucas was in the math club, so that's the missing link. In a sufficient assumption question, the correct answer would simply be, Lucas is in the math club. If that were true, the conclusion would follow smoothly with certainty. Boom, argument complete. Now let's take it one level deeper. Sometimes the gap is a category shift, like when the premise talks about one group and the conclusion talks about another, but there's no bridge between them. For example, suppose we had the premise, all members of the ethics committee are required to attend the retreat. Conclusion, therefore, Dr. Lee is required to attend the retreat. Looks fine at first, but what's missing? Did they ever say Dr. Lee is a member of the ethics committee? Nope. So again, the sufficient assumption would be Dr. Lee is a member of the ethics committee. That one sentence fills the gap and makes the argument work perfectly. This is what sufficient assumption questions are really about. They're not testing your memory, they're testing your ability to find exactly what's missing. And once you train yourself to look for that specific hole, not just vaguely what's wrong, but the one sentence that would seal the logic shut, you stop feeling overwhelmed and start gaining total control. Now let's talk about how to predict the missing link before looking at the answers. And this is where average scorers and high scorers part ways. If you want to stop getting tricked, stop second guessing yourself, and start getting these questions right consistently, you need to do one thing before you even glance at the answer choices. Predict the missing assumption. This step is the difference between being in control and being at the mercy of 5 confusing options. Because here's what happens when you don't predict. You start reading answer A. It kind of makes sense. Answer B, though, sounds even better. Then C introduces something new, and now you're not sure. By the time you get to E, your brain is foggy, your confidence is gone, and you just pick what feels logical. That's not strategy, that's roulette. So let's avoid that entirely. Now, you've already broken down the stimulus. You know the premise, you know the conclusion, and you've spotted the logical gap. Now ask yourself one question. What must be true in order for the conclusion to logically follow from the premise? Not what might help, not what makes this stronger, but what completes the argument with 100% certainty. If you can answer that, you've got your prediction. Here's an example. The premise says if a person exercises regularly, then they are healthy. Conclusion, Sophia is healthy. The conclusion makes a leap. It assumes Sophia exercises regularly, but never says it explicitly. So, what's the prediction? Sophia exercises regularly. That is the missing sufficient assumption. If that statement were true, then the premise guarantees the conclusion. Now here's why the prediction works. The LSAT is designed to confuse people who don't know what to look for. They add attractive but irrelevant phrasing. They love to introduce answers that sound vaguely logical but miss the key connection. And they love to bait you with language from the stimulus that sounds related but doesn't actually guarantee the conclusion. When you predict first, you filter out all of that. You're no longer asking which answer sounds reasonable, you're asking which one matches the exact thing I already decided is missing. That is how high scorers operate. They don't fall for elegant sounding traps because they're anchored to a specific goal. Now, you might be wondering, what if the prediction isn't there? Let's say you've predicted the missing link, but when you look at the answer choices, you don't see it. What now? You look for a logically equivalent version. The LSAT loves to play dress up. Instead of giving you your predicted statement directly, they give you something like the contrapositive or a paraphrased version of the same logic. For example, if your prediction was, if someone is healthy, then they exercise regularly, the correct answer might be the contrapositive. If someone does not exercise regularly, then they are not healthy. Same meaning, different presentation. That is the contrapositive, and it's just as good. Now, prediction is not optional. It is essential for sufficient assumption questions. When you predict the missing assumption, you take control of the question. You stop reacting and you start filtering. You spot trap answers instantly because they don't match what the logic requires. And best of all, you move faster with more certainty and less stress. Let's now talk about what to do once you do start reviewing the answer choices, because that's where things can still go sideways unless you've got a system. Now, the answer choices are usually where students get stuck, because even with all that prep, the answer choices are still written in a way that feels dense, abstract, and often confusing on purpose. So here is your new approach. You're going to evaluate each choice like a lawyer cross-examining a witness. You're not asking, does this sound smart? You're asking, does this guarantee the conclusion? The first question you want to ask is, does it directly bridge the gap? Does it provide the one missing link between the premise and the conclusion? It doesn't have to be poetic. It doesn't have to sound impressive. It just has to connect the dots cleanly and completely. If you predicted something like Lucas is in the math club, then that's what you're looking for. Not Lucas likes clubs or students who enjoy puzzles often join the math club. Those might sound relevant, but they don't complete the logic. Only the exact link will do. If it doesn't build the bridge 100%, you want to eliminate it immediately. Second question you want to ask, is it strong enough? Most students have a bad habit they don't even realize. They're afraid of strong language. They see a choice that uses words like all, every, or only if, and they flinch. They think it's too extreme. That can't be right. But here's the truth. In sufficient assumption questions, strong language is not just acceptable, it is often required. You're trying to make the conclusion follow logically. That doesn't happen with soft language like usually, might, or some. That kind of hedging leaves room for doubt. And you don't want doubt, you want certainty. So instead of avoiding strong answers, start seeing them as your best candidates. Remember, this is one of the only question types where extreme language is a feature, not a bug. Now, the next question you want to ask, does it introduce brand new but irrelevant ideas? This is a classic trap. The LSAT loves to slip in answer choices that mention things the stimulus never talked about. New variables, new categories, new concepts. For example, if you had an argument where the premise said all astronauts must pass a physical fitness test, and the conclusion said, therefore, Maya must pass a physical fitness test, then imagine this wrong answer. If someone's training to be a firefighter, they must pass a physical fitness test. Think to yourself, wait, firefighters? Where did that come from? Totally brand new subject means you should automatically disqualify the choice. If the answer mentions a concept that is never covered in the stimulus or clearly implied by the stimulus, you want to toss it out. It's not helping complete the logic, it's starting a whole new argument. You also want to ask, is it reversing or flipping the logic? This is one of the most dangerous and common traps, reversed logic. If the premise says all A's are B's, and the conclusion says, therefore all B's are C's, then imagine this tempting but wrong answer. All C's are B's. See the problem? It feels close, but it's flipping the logic in the wrong direction. Instead of connecting A to B to C, it's saying C requires B. It's the wrong direction, so it's the wrong answer. And this kind of mistake is sneaky because it sounds logical, but it doesn't build the connection that you need. It scrambles everything up. So whenever you're tempted by an answer, ask yourself, is this moving in the right direction? If it's backwards or if it switches cause and effect, it's out. Now, the final question you want to ask, does it restate your prediction or it's contrapositive? That is your golden ticket. If the choice either matches your prediction directly or states it's contrapositive, you're probably looking at the right answer. That is why prediction is so important. It gives you a lens to filter through all the other noise. And here's a tip for you. The right answer is often boring. It might feel obvious or redundant. Don't let that throw you off. In fact, if an answer feels too clean or too perfect, that's usually a sign you've done everything right. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to start with your prediction. You're going to look for the answer that completes the logic 100%. You want to be okay with strong language. You want to watch out for irrelevant details and logic reversals, and you don't want to reject a choice just because it sounds too simple. If it connects the premise to the conclusion without leaving any gaps, lock it in. Now let's look at one more advanced layer the LSAT throws in to confuse even the strongest students: disguised logic through contrapositives. Now, you might be wondering, why does the LSAT use this trick? They want to test to see if you understand structure, or if you're just memorizing surface level patterns. If you are blindly looking for the exact wording of your prediction, you're going to miss it. But if you understand what the argument needs, and you recognize that the contrapositive is a valid form, you're going to spot it instantly. This is how top scorers get through hard questions in under 90 seconds. They don't get rattled when the answer doesn't look like what they expected. They pause, they flip it, and they reframe it. Then they see, oh, that is my answer. It's just rewritten. So here's your step-by-step process. If none of the answers match your prediction, stop. Reread your prediction carefully. Flip it into its contrapositive, and then scan the choices again and look for the match. Of course, you don't have to do this every single time, but when your prediction isn't showing up cleanly, this is the tool that pulls the answer out of hiding. Remember, the contrapositive is not a trick, it is a translation. And once you get comfortable recognizing it, you're going to unlock answers that confuse 90% of test takers. It's the difference between understanding the LSAT as a memorization test and understanding it as a test of logic. So let's bring it all together here. Sufficient assumption questions are not about being clever. They're about being precise, systematic, and surgical. Your first step is going to be spot the question type to make sure that you are in fact dealing with a sufficient assumption question. Look for key phrases in the question stem like if assumed, follows logically, allows, and enables. If the question's asking for what would guarantee the conclusion, you're in the right place. Then you want to break down the argument. Separate the premise, meaning the evidence, from the conclusion, what the author's trying to prove, from the gap, which is the part that's missing to make the conclusion follow logically. And this is where you ID the flaw. Then you predict the missing link. Ask yourself, what must be true for this conclusion to follow from the premise with 100% certainty? This is your anchor. It's what you're scanning for when you look at the answer choices. Then you want to evaluate each answer strategically. Use a clear filter. Does this bridge the gap completely? Is it strong enough to force the conclusion? Does it avoid introducing irrelevant new ideas? Is it moving in the correct logical direction? And does it match your prediction or its contrapositive? Anything that doesn't check the boxes is out. And yes, watch for contrapositives. If your prediction doesn't show up word for word, don't panic, just flip it and translate it. The right answer might be sitting right in front of you, just wearing a disguise. And once you master this system, the questions stop being intimidating. They stop being puzzles, and they instead become checklists. And the more you practice this step-by-step process, the more predictable they feel. No guesswork, no stress, no hesitation, just clean, logical wins.